So today we'll be talking about Chapter 12, Section 2, and it's called Reconstructing Society. As we talk about various groups that contributed to the rebuilding of Southern society after the war, we're going to be talking about several different conflicting ideologies about how the South should be incorporated back into the Union. We talked about that at the political level yesterday. Now we're going to be talking about that at the popular level, about how people reacted to life after the war. And so since we're talking about how people reacted to after the war, we need to look at how this affected the South. We're going to start by looking at physical and economic conditions. Now by 1870, all Confederate states in the Union, because we now no longer call it Union and Confederacy, it is now just the Union, the South has surrendered. But all Confederate states have installed Republican governments leading them. These are not democratically elected Republican governments. These are installed with the Union military. Meanwhile, much of the South has been destroyed. Many buildings, many roads, many railroads, homes, farms. There has been a great, untold physical devastation that has wreaked the South. No hurricane has ever matched the destruction that the Civil War has wrought upon the United States. Many in the South were left impoverished after the Civil War. Value of Southern properties plummeted. Confederate money was now worthless. 1/5 of all white males in the South were dead as a result of the war. That's 20% of the white male population of the South died in this war. Many countless more had lost limbs. Tens of thousands of black males had died in the South, as well as in the North during the war. In fact, as many as 180,000 black soldiers served in the Union during the war. So the question is, what is to be done? What is the response to this? One idea was to provide public works programs, to set up public transportation, to set up homes for orphans who have lost families in the war, programs and structures for the disabled, opportunities for education where none existed before. In fact, many Southern states had no public schools prior to the war. But all of these programs are going to take a great deal of investment, both public investment in the form of government programs and private investment in the form of entrepreneurs. But one of the major problems here is that no Northern entrepreneurs wanted to invest in the South. And so states were forced to raise taxes within their own communities to raise funds for these programs. Because these programs were desperately needed. Roads had to be built. Public schools needed to be established. Orphanages needed to be built. But those programs cost lots of money. And the money is not flowing in naturally. What we often forget is that after a war of this scale, there will be hundreds of thousands of dead to be buried. In many cases, the need for expediency and war required that armies left the dead where they lied, but they would still have to be buried. And so clearing the remains of battlefields was a job that had to be done, and these people had to be buried with honor and could not be left to lie. One thing we also forget, many people became homeless after this war. If an invading army is coming, it doesn't matter what your political loyalties are. You need to get out of the way. You need to run. It doesn't matter if they're your friends or not. An invading army is dangerous, and you need to get away. And many people did just that. But what happens when you pack up everything and run? You become homeless. The formal term for that is a refugee. There was a refugee crisis in the southern United States caused by this war. And what have we experienced in recent times with refugees? What has been the sentiment towards the Syrian refugees? So again, distrust. Many refugees experience an unwelcome feeling because countries don't want them. And yes, southern refugees experience those same sentiments in many cases because they were forced to pick up everything and run away. Now, after the war was over, many of these people tried to return home to a life that has been forever changed. Meanwhile, though the war was over, it did not cure the animosity that Northerners felt towards the South or that Southerners felt towards the North. In fact, if you voted Republican as a Southerner, you were considered a traitor. Southern Republicans were called Scalawags. I know the term doesn't carry over or translate in the modern day. We don't use that term as much anymore, but Scalawags was a very offensive term. It referred to a Southerner who was voting against his people. You were a Scalawag. Most of these Southern Republicans, which, by the way, my family were Southern Republicans, both before and after the war. Most of these Southern Republicans, like my family, were small farmers. We didn't own slaves. I mean, heck, my family barely owned anything except for what they built themselves at that time. My dad was the first of his family to be born in a hospital. Everyone before that delivered their own babies or had a midwife come. They were subsistence farmers. They lived off the land. My grandma used to say, who, by the way, knew lots of people who were in the Civil War at this time. She remembered this time period. She used to say we didn't even know a Great Depression was going on because we were always poor. And we never went to the store because we couldn't afford to. She remembered covered wagons. But her family were small farmers. And the issue of slavery was not one they had a stake in, because they didn't own slaves. But they were Republicans. But they would have been considered traitors by many. Now, some people did move from the North to the South. While Northern investment in the South was not significant enough to pull the South out of the depression that they were in after the war, there were Northerners who moved south. But they were often met with animosity. They were called carpetbaggers. And that's a term that some hateful people still use to refer to people who have moved from the North. My mom moved from Michigan to Cookeville, Tennessee when she was in high school. She was called all manner of names. Carpetbagger was the least offensive, simply because of the fact that her family had moved from the North and that she spoke with a Michigan accent and that her dad speaks with a Brooklyn accent still today. But they moved from the North. and they stuck out like a sore thumb. And to many, they were unwanted and unwelcome, simply because of where they were from. And that was in the 1960s. That was 100 years after the war was over. And yet still, when I was in high school, there was an arsonist who went around burning people's homes to the ground who had moved here from the north. And that was in the 1990s. That was almost 150 years, almost after the war was over. In many ways, we are still dealing with the repercussions of this war. And culturally, we still remain divided. And that's unfortunate. Even the media was perpetrating this myth of Northerners coming as carpetbaggers to take and steal and take advantage of.
In 1869, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. senator. Eventually, 22 blacks became members of Congress. On the home front, Reconstruction influenced the state's political events. During the winter of 1867 to 1868, 10 southern states held state constitutional conventions. Since most of the political leaders of the South were part of the Confederacy and considered traitors, they could not participate in designing the state's principles and framework of government. Therefore, the delegates to these conventions were dedicated blacks of the Republican Party, along with anti-secessionist whites from the South known as Scalawags, and bold whites from the North known as carpetbaggers. Together, they wrote good constitutions for each of their states, which provided for public schools and equal rights for all of the state's citizens, regardless of race. As the states approved their new constitutions and the 14th Amendment, they were readmitted back into the United States with full states' rights. In 1866, Tennessee was readmitted into the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana were readmitted during the year of 1868. Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas were readmitted by 1870.
Now, the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to African Americans. And of all the Southern Republicans that were being called Scalawags, African Americans were the largest group of Southern Republicans, which makes perfect sense. But I want you to understand that in many areas, 90% of African Americans voted. And most of them voted Republican at this time. Because it was the Republican Party, after all, that had ended slavery. But 90% of African Americans voted. And yet today, no one votes anymore. I hear all manner of excuses. Oh, I just don't like either person. Or, it's just too much trouble. Or I've got to work that day. Or I've got other things to do. Excuse, excuse, excuse. But when you take that right away from someone, and then they see the amount of sacrifice that was made to have that right, then it is more greatly appreciated. I'd love to see voting records of those who have served in the armed forces versus those who have not. You know, when you have put your life on the line, I think it means more. Or when you have, and I do believe, and I don't have data to support that yet, but I'm sure it's out there. But when you have seen people, or when you have gone through a thing as a people historically, for example, when African Americans did not have the right to vote, and then they saw and they participated in a large movement where many died so that they could have that right, they showed up. And they voted.
Two years after the war ended in 1867, black men could vote. And this is very important because finally they have a say in what is going to happen in their life politically. The reason why the vote was so important for blacks, it was a chance for them to actually have a say in how the government was going to be run, whether it was local, state, or federal. The interesting thing about this is that locally, blacks had more issues. It was very difficult to get anything passed. However, blacks were involved very much in the state and federal level, even holding political positions. In our collection, we have a document, is the registration of black voters, or in this case, color voters, in the township of Midlothian from 1870. And this document deals with black men, because the amendment only says that men can vote at this time. Over various amount of days in May of 1870, of these men finally getting a chance to register to vote. Finally, you have black men, and I keep emphasizing that, black men get a chance to actually have some kind of control, something that they didn't have before the Civil War. Most of them were Republicans. However, the Republican Party was very much split in the black community. You had both your conservative and you had your radical. And the conservative ones were most of the time already free before the war. They had set up businesses, they were ministers, and they got along with the white community and depended on the whites for their patronage. The radical side of the Republican Party was actually the freedmen who didn't have the same jobs, the same opportunities, and were very vocal to the point that sometimes riots would break out within the city or in the surrounding areas. And this was a big concern among the conservative blacks because they felt like they needed to be able to work along with whites. And the reason why you have this conflict in the first place is because whites have now got to learn how to live with free black people. And so you've got two races clashing at this particular period of time because a lot of the free people wanted the same rights and felt like they deserved the spoils of the war, and it wasn't exactly happening.
With the election of 1875, there was a deal that was cut, unbeknownst to a lot of the electorate, between the Republican Party and the state officials in the former Confederate states. March of 1876, federal soldiers were removed, and these former Confederate officials were allowed to come back into power. The former Confederates who were coming into power then were allowed to, how could I say, revert back to some of the old ways that had existed prior to the late war, and which mean they, how could I say, eliminated a lot of the black voters by a lot of methods, and mainly the method that was used was through intimidation. The Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, a lot of those organizations that were used to intimidate black voters. Because they were intimidated, a lot of the black voters stayed away because not only was it against them, but it was against their families. So they decided that it was best sometimes to stay away from the polls. Plessy versus Ferguson was a major Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court decided in 1896 the separate but equal doctrine, and that doctrine lasted for 40 to 41 years, and in that doctrine sprung Jim Crow laws. There were a lot of stipulations that were made for black voters, like poll tax, the grandfather clause. They said they didn't want to go back to slavery, but it was a form of slavery in a way. Maybe not physical chained, but there were other ways and other means that to me seemed to be slavery all over again.
Now, Southern Republicans, did not vote Republican out of a deep desire for civil rights for blacks. In fact, many voted Republican because it was in their economic interest for slavery to be ended. Because if you're a poor white farmer in the South and you're trying to make a living, how are you supposed to compete against this large plantation? It's the same small business versus corporation argument. And so not many of these scalawags were voting Republican out of a deep desire for civil rights, except for the African American community. In fact, many poor whites wound up rejoining the Democratic Party. And so I want you to imagine for a moment that you have been tasked with leading a hostile people. Anybody ever tried to volunteer in a middle school or elementary school? I mean, okay, you have been tasked with leading a hostile crowd. Good luck with that. Everyone should have to experience that at some point in your life. It is a stressful, unpleasant experience. I taught middle school for 1 year. Out of a desire for my own health and safety and sanity, I went to high school immediately. Realized the error of my ways. And then now I have the pleasure of teaching you guys, and it's been a lot of fun. So it's a great pleasure. But I just want you, I think everyone should have to have that experience. The reason I bring that up is because imagine you are one of these Republican military governors of a hostile district. You are now tasked with leading and governing a people that don't want you there. And the only reason you have the power is because you have troops on the ground. If you have family who have served overseas, ask them about their experience of trying to help set up a new government in Iraq or Afghanistan. It doesn't matter what level of command they were in. Anyone who served in Iraq or Afghanistan will tell you it was a difficult experience trying to work with people who don't necessarily want you there. You know, for example, three of my roommates served. One fought in Fallujah. He was a Marine interpreter who would go out on patrols, and his job was to talk to people. He learned Farsi, that's the common language spoken in Iraq. And he said, you know, I would talk to people every day. That's my job. Talk, talk, talk. And people were generally friendly. Most people appreciated what we were trying to do. But generally, Iraq wanted their independence back. They were ready. Even those who were sympathetic to the American cause were ready and wanted us gone. Now try to lead that group. Again, most were pleasant, but there was an insurrection movement. And that's how we are in the South after the Civil War. Most people were peaceful and just wanted to get along. But yes, there was an insurrection group, and we're going to talk about the Klan soon. And so meanwhile, these Republican governors are trying to think, how am I going to get these people to cooperate with anything? And so the strategy used, which is the exact same strategy that we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, was to appoint Democrats to local positions of government, meaning to work with the indigenous, essentially. Because now we have to think of the South as a conquered state. And now we have to go about the process of nation building in the South. Because we've destroyed their government. Now we have to rebuild it. And so one of the tactics used is appoint indigenous leaders. It's something that goes all the way back to colonialism. It's what we used when the British conquered South Africa. They appointed local leaders. And now we're appointing local leaders here. Meanwhile, some whites support Republicans. Many felt that slavery ending was good for the South, like the small farmer I told you about. However, many whites refused to accept the new status of equal rights for blacks. In fact, this just blows my mind. Several thousand planters, the plantation owners, actually fled the country. The very same ones who started this war didn't do so out of deep desire of loyalty for the Confederacy. They did so out of a desire for profit. And when their source of revenue dried up, they took their business to Europe, to Mexico, to Brazil, to places that had not yet outlawed slavery, places they could set up plantations and operate independently. Many went to the Philippines, many went to Hawaii, many went to islands where they could get away with owning slaves. I think that's this. Now, in regards to New Won freedoms, at first, former slaves had to tread very carefully about testing the limits of their freedom. I mean, can you imagine? Imagine that you have been a prisoner for 20 years, and now you're free. You got to watch Shawshank Redemption sometime. Just an amazing film. Morgan Freeman talks about that experience. He's free now, and he's working. He asks his boss at the grocery store, he says, "Massa, can I use the bathroom now?" And his boss stops him. He said, "Don't call me master. And don't ask me to use the bathroom. Go. You're free. Do what you want to do." But Morgan Freeman had been a prisoner for over 20 years. And he struggled with this newfound freedom. Because he's been told when to go. He's been told where to go all his life. And now he's free. That can be a difficult experience. That's a tough transition. Some former slaves leave the South, and I don't blame them at all. In fact, a great migration begins at this time, where African Americans begin moving north and west in large numbers. But also, there's this generation-long process of heartbreaking stories. Many African Americans and former slaves spend the rest of their lives looking for loved ones. Ads in the paper. I mean, you can go back and study and look at ads in classifieds. Has anyone seen this person? I'm looking for my wife. I'm looking for my father. I'm looking for my son. For the next generation. Former slaves can now marry legally. Did you know that? We prevented slaves from marrying legally? And used some of the very same excuses that people are using about homosexual couples now. The very same types of bigoted comments were being used about African Americans that are being used now about homosexual couples. But now they get to marry legally. And now, yes, they get to keep their children. For the first time in the history of our country, the Constitution actually applied. And all did mean all, for once. But yes, free people of all ages are going to seek an education. This is where I used to get on my stump a lot in talking about education. Because you don't appreciate a thing until it's been taken away. And slaves were not allowed to even learn how to read or write. And so education became very valuable. In fact, many African Americans established schools and universities like Booker T. Washington. Initially, most teachers were whites who had moved from the North, like the clip of the Freedmen's Bureau I showed you. But by 1869, most teachers are black, who had sought an education at places like Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. Many African Americans founded churches. Yes, slaves were not allowed to even found a church. They were required to go to the white churches and hear from the pulpit every Sunday how they were an inferior people. And the misguided concept that they were the descendants of Japheth, that just makes me angry. You guys ever heard that? The story of Japheth? This is the story that whites would use for hundreds of years. Sometimes you still hear it. I heard it growing up. It's a big part of the movie Mississippi Burning. Whites would use this story to justify the way they treated blacks. So in the book of Genesis, there's the story of Noah and the flood, right? Everybody grew up with the cute animals on the boat and all that. It was a story you don't hear as often. After the flood, they've all settled down. Noah got slapped drunk one night. True story. He passed out. He was naked. And one of his sons, named Japheth, saw him, came into the tent, and was like, "Whoa, Dad, hey, claw my eyes out real quick, hang on." And he goes back and he tells his brothers, "Hey guys, Dad is passed out naked and I'm kind of freaked out right now." So his brothers walk in backwards and cover their father. Once Noah wakes up, so I guess he sobers up the next day, and he goes, "What happened?" And his brothers go, "Well, Japheth saw you, freaked out, told us, and we covered you up." Noah cursed Japheth. He said, "You will go and live in the Southlands, and you will be, and your people will be, servants to your brothers for all time." And many whites say that African Americans are descendants of Japheth. And they use that to perpetuate the curse that Noah gave to his son. And they use that very story to justify. Now here's the thing. You're going to believe what you want to believe. You're going to shape your worldview around what you want to see. And if you want to see blacks as inferior, you're going to interpret that story the way you want to. So African Americans went on to found their own churches. The African American Methodist Episcopal Church was one of the most popular and prominent. African Americans formed thousands of volunteer organizations to attempt to build up their communities and help one another. I love this picture. This is an elderly lady, photographed, by the way, who was once a slave, who's being taught to read by a younger lady. And I always wonder when I look at that picture, did this younger lady have to grow up as a slave? Was she allowed to read and write from a very young age, while perhaps her grandmother was not? I don't know the background behind that story, but I like to look at it and think, I wonder how grateful that woman is for being allowed, for being able to learn. Because when I think of that picture, I think of my grandmother and how she wasn't able to go to school beyond the 8th grade. She just wasn't. There was no school for her beyond the 8th grade. And so she went to the 8th grade a second time. Not because she did poorly the first time, but because it was the only school she got to go to. And she would walk to school. And I clocked it. She told me where they lived and where the school was. It was 4 miles to that school. She walked there and walked back every day. And all through her life, she lived to 97. That was the biggest thing she always instilled in us, was a love of education. Because she didn't get to have it. Now, as I said, most African Americans were Republican. And once blacks got the right to vote, many African Americans went on to hold local, state, and even federal positions, such as Hiram Revels, who became the first black senator. Many states, such as Alabama, or Georgia, or Mississippi, have as many or more black citizens than white citizens. Yet, there were only 16 African Americans in Congress by 1867. Okay, now by 1866, Republican governments required the repeal of most black codes. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 legalized segregation, though Republican governments never enforced segregation. Yet it was enforced at the popular level. For example, A black man might not get arrested for sitting in a white seat, but he's certainly going to be drug off and beat half to death. Might not see jail, but an angry mob might pull him out and hang him anyway. Meanwhile, most blacks focused on building up their own community. The issue of total integration is one that's going to take a long time, but it was not of immediate concern for freed blacks. And we'll talk about differing philosophies of civil rights, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois in our next essay project. Now, William Tecumseh Sherman was hardcore. I mean, it's like we unleashed Hitler on the South. However, Hitler had a heart in this case. Sherman was willing to do unspeakable things in the name of ending the war and perhaps even ending slavery. And I think he did have, but I think Sherman did have a heart. For example, any slave who would escape their plantations, any African American who would serve in his army, would be promised 40 acres of land and a mule they could use to start out. And so Sherman, as he conquered and burned and pillaged and looted and did all these horrible things, was actually helping former slaves to settle down and get started and settle on this abandoned land. Now, President Johnson, after the war, ordered all these slaves who had been given land by General Sherman to be evicted from their property so these plantation owners could go back to their homes. Many Republicans, meanwhile, rejected the seizing of property from these former slaves. Meanwhile, the question of plantations. The plantation system didn't actually die. It just changed. Plantations were never outlawed. In fact, I mean, you go to Coast Carolina, you're going to see giant farms. You will see large labor forces picking cotton. Hasn't changed too much. Yes, some mechanization, but still. So many planters feared they would be unable to make a profit if they had to pay people. So they just decided we will pay them very, very little. And they continued their plantations, and it worked out. Because what they could do is hire these people to work, pay them the equivalent of what they would have paid a slave to live and eat, and they wouldn't lose much money. So many freed slaves wound up working in the mills. Many wound up working on the railroads. In many cases, they were forced to go back to plantations. In some cases, landless African Americans would have to sign labor contracts with planters where they would work as de facto slaves, yet they would be paid. It wasn't a very good system, but that was what many desperate freed blacks were forced to do. Some could work as sharecroppers, where they would live on the land in a rent-to-own form of system and pay off their rent to own or their mortgage with their crops. And the idea was that in time, they would own the land they worked on. And so sharecropping. Some argued was a cycle of poverty, that farmers could work the land, they could pay off their mortgage with the value of their crops. However, a bad harvest put them further in debt. And so some argue as a cycle of poverty. Sharecroppers were supposed to have a chance to climb the economic ladder, but by the time they shared their crops and paid their debts, they rarely had any money left. A sharecropper often became tied to one plantation, having no choice but to work until his or her debts were paid.
Congress refused to seat Southerners elected to the House and Senate, many of whom had been leaders of the Confederacy. It passed a bill granting citizenship rights to African Americans, a law that President Johnson said was unconstitutional. He vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode his veto. Congress also passed the 14th Amendment, which sought to give African Americans equal rights to other American citizens. African Americans began playing an active role in politics and won election to many public offices. The radical Republicans began to win more and more support. In 1868, war hero Ulysses S. Grant won the presidential election for the Republicans. Strengthened by the votes of African Americans, many Republicans won election in the South. Angry at being shut out of power, some Southern whites resorted to violence and created societies to terrorize blacks. The most notorious of these societies was the Ku Klux Klan, whose members wore hoods over their heads. They attacked and killed African Americans in the South and whites who supported the freed men. By the mid-1870s, though, Northern interest in Reconstruction had weakened. By 1874, Republicans lost control of most state governments in the South. The new governments were dominated by whites, and they passed new laws that took away African Americans' rights. In 1876, Reconstruction came to an end. Segregation took hold in the South. State governments passed laws that created separate schools, hospitals, theaters, and restaurants for whites and blacks. Many African Americans and poor whites in rural areas were forced to become sharecroppers. A sharecropper is a farmer who rents land and pays rent with a share of his crops. This new rule pushed people into debt and poverty. By the 1880s, the South's economy began to recover and new industries appeared. Agricultural output began to grow. Cotton production, which had lagged during the war, boomed again. Planters put more land into tobacco production and output grew. By 1900, a new South was emerging and an industrial age was underway. But the promise of equal rights for African Americans in the South was a distant memory. Did you know? Reconstruction established a commitment to a society based on equality under the law. A century later, during the Civil Rights Movement, Americans, both black and white, would build on that commitment as they faced another struggle for racial equality.
Despite the changes that followed Reconstruction, the South remained segregated. African American and white children attended separate schools and generally received an inferior education. Eventually, enough people wanted change, and they began the struggle for integration.
Have you ever had to fight for something you believed in?
My parents said I should stop dancing because it came in conflict with my academics, and I had to convince them over time that I did love dance so much, and now I'm still dancing.
There was a list that went around the school, and people were writing things on the list that they disliked about my friend, and I stuck by my friend.
I'm fighting against the dress code saying that you have to have your shirt tucked in.
I had an argument with my mom a few weeks ago. I wanted my curfew to be moved from midnight to 1, and I told her that she should trust me enough to know that I won't do anything that I'm not supposed to, and trust me enough to know that I pick good friends, and she finally moved it to 1:30.
I really wanted to make the varsity tennis team this year, so I went to all these camps over the summer, and I played 4 hours every day during the week, and I still didn't make it.
50 years ago, Prince Edward County, Virginia, and Clarendon County, South Carolina were 2 of 5 communities that brought their demands for equal education and equal treatment under the law to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Now, unfortunately, cotton was no longer king in the South. Actually, even prior to the Civil War, many European countries had already found cheaper sources of cotton. As other countries also increased their own cotton productions, the South attempted to keep production at its pre-war levels, but also attempted to diversify by getting into the textile business, by growing tobacco, but they generally would have to pay less than what people could make in the North, and so many workers were fleeing the South, moving to the North. Many banks had held Confederate debt, had accepted Confederate money as currency. Those banks failed. and the South was generally in a state of economic depression after the war was over. And so we'll talk about its collapse and the collapse of Reconstruction